Gee, I thought I was in class 3, but. So I'm going to talk about just that, my stochastic career path, and there's 4 parts to the talk. I'll cover each of them very briefly, but I want to start with a story of how I came into science. I think a kind of unusual route. I was a literature major as an undergrad, and I was in graduate school in literature at the University of Illinois. And I left my studies and went to work for a publishing company. And one day I was having lunch in 1966. I should pause so you can compute. In 1966, and I had this thing I called an epiphany at the time, which was, whereas I had noticed that, dispassionately noticed that I had done pretty well in mathematics in high school, SAT, the one course I took in college, GRE, it had no meaning for me. And I wanted to write literary criticism, and I wanted to write fiction, and I made efforts in that direction, and it didn't take me long to realize that while the literary criticism was well received by my professors, but my writing was awful. It was convoluted, self-conscious, boring. So I decided maybe I could learn to love what I was good at instead of becoming good at what I loved. So I decided to go to graduate school in mathematics. Well, there was a little problem with that. It was summer, I had no major. I went to the administration at Northwestern, which was the closest university to where I was having lunch the day I made this decision. And the administrators there said, very sarcastically, we have this thing, we call it an admissions process. It starts the winter before. You don't have a major in mathematics, just for starters. Nonetheless, I went over to the math department, Lund Hall, on Lake Michigan in Evanston, Illinois, and there weren't many people around, but there was one person named Evan Matlis, an algebraist. He was smoking his pipe, and somehow he agreed to listen to my story. And then he said, amazingly, he said, okay, I'm going to get you into the starting PhD program, which was starting, like a month later, and only on the condition, though, that your parents can pay the full freight. Of course, we will not give you a penny. Anyway, I started my PhD in fall of '66 in math. It was a disaster. I didn't have any mathematics preparation. I was failing all my courses, and I had a lot of help from people like Ralph Boas, who was the department head. My advisor, Michael Marcus, Alexandra Bello, and others gave me moral and technical support, and I made it through. All right. So then I went to the University of Massachusetts, and I began working in the areas of analysis and probability. Probability theory is the area in which I got my degree, and particularly on stochastic processes. So the best known example of that, probably to the extent it's known at all to the general public, is Brownian motion. So the sample paths of stochastic processes are very, very irregular. They're not like the functions you study in calculus with derivatives and so forth and so on. They're highly irregular. So in Brownian motion, a particle is bombarded constantly, and it moves in a very erratic and chaotic motion. And the mathematical models were developed by Einstein and Wiener and others. If you just look at one coordinate of it, you just wind up with an ordinary function, like the function you study in calculus, in the sense that it's just a function on the real line taking real values. But it's not at all like the functions you ever encounter in calculus or other courses. It's much, much more irregular. So, okay. Except for the mathematicians, for everybody else, you can just ignore this, and I'm just going to say one thing about it. So here's the function x of s, and there's this thing called the local time. Because the function is so irregular, we have no tools in analysis to study functions that are highly irregular. Continuous, but for example, nowhere differentiable. At no point is there a derivative. So even if we try to draw something that we think is super irregular, it's going to have a derivative except where we change directions. But these paths, the paths of stochastic processes, the sample realizations of Markov and Gaussian and other processes, are much more irregular than anything we can imagine. The beauty of this transform is that the regularity in ordinary terms of alpha corresponds to the irregularity of the function. So for example, if the alpha transform is just continuous, already it says that this original function that it is the transform of has a derivative nowhere. And then similarly, other properties of the alpha transform correspond to other irregularities of this. So that's all I'm going to say about that. So I decided to, after working in that for some years, I decided to see what applied math was like and statistics, and I had in mind a comment made to me by a statistician named Morris Skabinski in the middle 70s. He said what I wrote there. Now, I don't know if I met Skabinski's criterion, but I became interested in statistics. And at that time at Brown University, there was a group surrounding Ulf Grenander who were working in applying the stochastic modeling and new ideas in simulation to imaging. So I actually hooked up with my brother Stuart, and we wrote this paper. That was my first paper in the field. The paper attracted a fair amount of attention, and it proposed a new way of looking at image processing. And in a nutshell, the basic idea was to associate an image with an imaginary physical system. And the mechanism for doing this is in the physical system, there's something called an energy function, and that determines a probability distribution, the Boltzmann distribution. And through the correspondence between what are called Gibbs distributions and Markov random fields, you get a probability distribution on images in the form of what's called a Markov random field. The analogy, you could pursue the analogy to use the Gibbs formulation for modeling and the Markov random field formulation for sampling. We took ideas from statistical physics, like heat bath algorithm and other simulation methods, formulated them rigorously, proved that the simulated annealing algorithm converged as long as you cooled slowly enough, and ... The point is that by using this analogy with statistical physics, we were able to recover an original image from degradation. So if you observe a degraded image, terribly blurred, noisy, messed up, we use the analogy with statistical physics to find out how to get very likely images, a very likely estimate of the original image, or images that were very likely under what's called the posterior distribution. But anyway, to guess the original image, the undegraded image. And we introduced along the way an algorithm called the Gibbs sampler and a variety of other things. Well, anybody who goes into image processing, not anybody at all, some people who go into image processing find themselves seduced by what's called the vision problem, or the AI side of it. That is to say, just given an ordinary photograph, describe it semantically. Tell a story about it. What's going on? What are the names of the objects that are in the photograph? If there are people, are they interacting, and so forth and so on. And in other words, build a description machine to automatically annotate a picture just from the pixel intensities. So you have to understand a picture is just an array of numbers representing intensities. So you just have a big array of numbers, 1,000 by 1,000 numbers, and you want to go from there to a semantic description of what's the scene depicts. That's an amazing problem that there has been progress. There are methods in the computer vision community to detect and roughly localize instances from a great many object categories. But as soon as you get to more complex aspects, you want to, I don't know, that car is parked. That takes some context to deduce. Maybe there might be people that are walking together, and so forth and so on. It's an infinity of possible explanations. You could tell a whole story from one picture. And that's a much deeper and more difficult problem than just saying, you know, there's a car here, there's a building there. So I became very interested in this problem, and I decided to attack it from the point of view of the 20 questions game. So probably all of you have played the game of 20 questions at some point. I guess when we were kids and we were in the back of the car, wanted to kill time, somebody would think of a famous person and you'd ask questions. And people are remarkably good at this. Of course, I guess that doesn't happen now. People are sitting in the back of the car looking at their whatever. But we used to do that. And people are astonishing in this way. Even if you watch children, very young children, play a game called Guess Who, they learn very quickly to ask coarse questions and a kind of sequence from coarse to fine. They ask very general questions, dead or alive, male or female, if you're thinking of a famous person. Maybe then go for something about coarse geography or coarse profession, and then hone it down, you know, winnow it down to very precise questions, very, very dedicated, specific questions, but they only come at the end, because at the very beginning, the answer is almost certainly going to be no to a very, very specific question. So you don't want to ask those until the end, until you have some sense of what's going on. So the idea was to apply this paradigm, which mathematically it's formulated in the context of Bayesian statistics and information theory. You can have a precise formulation of what you mean by the most informative question at any time, given all the previous answers. So I've been applying this to problems in imaging. For example, recognizing handwritten digits, but I'll just go right to this one next. So, for example, I want to track a road in a satellite image. The questions, the queries correspond to little teeny filters that correspond to a tiny fraction, a little rectangular window that you put down on the image, and you ask how road-like are the pixels in that window. Is it kind of something flat, maybe roughly 20 meters if it's a major highway, and then with stuff on one side and stuff on the other? Is it look like a road locally? And the answers are incredibly noisy. If you see these little image patches, you can't know whether you're on a super highway or not. But you ask enough of these questions and you start to get a sense of where the road is. And so that's how the algorithm operates. It just asks these questions sequentially and adaptively, each time choosing where to look next based on the place that would most reduce the conditional entropy, to use a technical term, of the location of the road, given all the previous answers and the new question. So it can be made precise in terms of information theory. And when you see the algorithm performing, where it decides to look next, it looks incredibly chaotic to the human eye. Sometimes it backtracks, it jumps forward, may get lost in a town. This was initiated here, it got lost, it started doing experiments all over the town, eventually realized it had to back up and start over, etc. Here's another example of a computer vision problem. Detecting and localizing faces in images. Nowadays, on your camera, you have a face detector. But most of these were developed during the 90s. Algorithms to identify faces in images. And if you apply this coarse-to-fine strategy to identifying faces, you're going to ask very general questions of the image, functionals of the data, that respond on faces, but also on many other structures that resemble faces locally. And then there's a steady progression from coarse to fine, asking finer and finer questions relative to the pose, for example, of the face, the scale, the slant, the location. And the result of it, when you're all finished, if you look at the density of work, in other words, if darkness reflects how much CPU time was spent in the vicinity of that location, when you process a scene coarse to fine, you spend very little time up here in the background. You quickly reject that, and almost all the processing is concentrated around faces and face-like structures. I'm going to skip that. So I've been working on this paradigm, among other approaches, for a long time. More recently, trying to apply it to richer semantic interpretations of scenes, but still with this basic paradigm of sequential and adaptive testing, and also to building a system to evaluate a computer vision system. So I think I can illustrate the approach by showing you a sample sequence of this test that we developed called a visual Turing test. So the first question, the constraint is you're going to ask binary questions, and it's relative to a population of images, and the constraint is that every binary question you ask has to be unpredictable. What does that mean? If you ask a question at any point, if I don't show you the image, but I show you all the answers to the previous questions, I give you what the question was and the answer, but you don't see the image, it's 50-50 in this population relative to this vocabulary. So for example, the first question, is there a person partially visible in this image? On this population of urban street scenes, that's a 50-50 question. Then the answer happened to be yes here. Is there a unique person? Ah, yes. So now you can instantiate that person and say that's person one. And person one can play a role in this developing story later on because this person has been uniquely instantiated. And then you go on, is person one carrying something, female, yes, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a vehicle? And you establish, oh, there's a unique vehicle in the designated region. You can ask questions about the vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. Remember, at every point, every question you're answering is a 50-50 question. So now behind this, there's a computer vision system which says it claims to be very good at processing images, and you have a human in the loop. So the questions are posed to the computer vision system. The computer vision system makes its answer. The human in the loops records yes or no. It can either give the true answer or not to the computer vision system. And every question counts the same because they're all 50-50. So you get it's a test. The computer vision system takes a test to see how well it can understand an image, what's in an image. And when you go on, you eventually instantiate another person, and then you can ask questions about the interaction among the people. Here's a third person. Is person one closer to the camera than person two? That was person one. I think the sitting person is person two. Person three, et cetera. Are person two and person three talking? Well, they do appear to be talking, et cetera. And you can see that the questions you ask later on would never be asked early because they'd almost certainly the answer would be no. Until you establish the players in the scene, the players in the storyline, you don't want to be asking detailed questions about how they're interacting with each other. You don't want to be asking whether is there a parked car in a region before you've established that there may be a car, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'll just finish with what I've done since coming to Johns Hopkins. There I made another detour, and I started working in the area of computational medicine. And the problem that I'm working on these days the most is tailoring cancer treatment to an individual molecular profile. So, for example, from gene expression data, trying to determine whether a person who has good prognosis or poor prognosis will respond to treatment using very high-dimensional biomolecular data. It's a very, very challenging problem. The more you look, the more diversity and variation and heterogeneity there is. It's almost as if every tumor is unique in terms of molecular signature, gene expression profile, and so forth. It's a really hard problem. And I'm trying to embed some statistical mechanism into the usual pure machine learning approach. So rather than just take tools off the shelf from machine learning and statistics, I'm trying to dig into the biology with collaborators at Johns Hopkins and embed mechanism into the story. So that takes a real collaboration with biologists. That's much harder than just taking things you're familiar with and trying them out in a new domain. I'll stop there. Thanks.
One question?
Deep learning figure into this picture.
All right, it fits. Well, deep learning is, there's a kind of mass migration to deep learning right now. It's very, very popular. It's better than I would have expected some years ago at detecting instances from a large large list of object categories and roughly localizing them, putting a box around them. I have doubts about how far that can be pushed. So to what extent that can be pushed to what I would call deep semantic interpretation of the kind I've been talking about. Not just recognizing a car, but recognizing whether it's parked, not just recognizing there are two people, but being able to determine they're walking together, talking together, things of that nature. I see a kind of exponential explosion in the number of possible interpretations. And so it's not clear to me how it will extend to what I'm calling the vision problem. It's certainly doing a good job, not as well as humans by any means, at part of the problem, some of these initial steps, but I don't see how to make the leap from, 10,000 object categories to a virtual infinite number of possible relations among subsets of categories.
Thank you.